Okay, thank you, everyone. I appreciate everyone getting up early this morning. As last night, I think all of us maybe stayed out a little bit longer than we might normally do. So I want to first thank DNVGL for a wonderful evening last night and just the activities that they had planned. And so thank you all very much for making your way here this morning to talk about synchronizing the gaps and talk about areas where we're able to make this utility space just a better, stronger system. So, and I think you guys have excellent. I have a few slides to tee up sort of the presentation, and then we'll get voice of the customer, some of those, and then we'll get started with some questions. So when I was first asked about this panel, I thought, when somebody came to me, that there'd be no more appropriate panel for us to moderate than about synchronizing the gaps. When Customize got started in 1998, it was when retail choice was starting, and there was a gap in understanding how do these wholesale market rules affect retailers, how can retailers make better decisions with these markets, and I thought those rules might take a couple of years to work out. Yeah, thank you. At least I heard a couple of laughs there. So 18 years later, I think we're probably further away from synchronizing some of the gaps in the wholesale retail market than we were 18 years ago. But I think that's just because I now understand some of the challenges there. So there are 5 areas, and I'm not sure, am I supposed to click on this button here? Excellent. So we're going to be talking about the different areas of where the gaps are. We'll be talking some about policy, energy policy, where are we going with energy policy, what regulations. So we have FERC on the panel here, which will help talk to us about how regulations can solve all of our problems. Okay, good. I got another laugh there. I appreciate that. But how good regulations can hopefully set a groundwork and a framework for competition to thrive. Then we'll be talking about markets. How can markets work? And markets, of course, are going to solve all of our problems. Equally as ludicrous. But markets can certainly help in creating resolving some of the gaps. Technology, we'll be focusing a lot on technology gaps. We have some of the leading technology companies on the stage here that are looking to address some of the gaps and solve those. And then, of course, at the root of all of this is customer demands. What is the customer looking for? How can we meet their needs in a better way? So, regulatory gaps. What motivates regulators to act? So, the number one thing that we talk about gaps and the way regulators fill gaps is because there's an emergency. So something really bad happens. And so we have the 1965-67 blackouts that caused Reliability Council to form. We have an oil embargo that says, hey, we need new and better generation locally here, and we implement it. We have natural disasters like the California wildfires, or Rita and Katrina, or more recently, Superstorm Sandy. We have technology, so sometimes there are changes. So the increased efficiency of renewable generation, the improvement of energy storage, the big data, and the changes that better interval meter data can bring to us are all technology changes that drive regulatory rules, often in a way to catch up to where the technology is going. And last but not least, politics plays a role in regulatory change, whether it's in greenhouse gas emissions or it's in the areas of lobbying by different industrial or commercial groups for certain policy changes that can affect the overall regulatory landscape. And not to be outdone, but the 72% rate increase in Maryland, that's a political event as well as a market event when rate caps came off there that caused pushback on the industry. So this is one of the emergencies that has been over this period since 1998. This was a really traditional thing. People should know how to cut trees under power lines. People should know how to communicate with one another. And yet that didn't happen. So on August 14th, 2003, the market looked like this. Lots of lights around Toronto, Chicago, a normal night sky. And then the lights went out. And the lights went out all the way through Canada. That many of you who are around the industry realize that a lot of flaws within communications and with the industry came out of this. And then various gaps were identified and looked to be resolved. And that happens, again, through this process, whether it's emergency or through the markets. So where are some of the market gaps that we've had historically? So I go back to the first one in 1927, where you had 3 utilities, PSE&G, PECO, and PPL, that wanted to build some large central generation units to serve their customers, but realized that none of them could justify it on their own. But if they worked together in a pool, they could actually build a 500 kV system, which later became the backbone of PJM, and to coordinate it. So at that point, it was a utility-owned system where it filled the gap of collaboration. Unfortunately, about 8 years later, after one of the most stellar bankruptcies by Samuel Insull in our industry, the PUCA Act was passed, which made monopolies by law. In the gap that it was trying to meet was the gap of too big to fail. They didn't want any utilities too big to fail, so let's make them smaller, let's make them constrained to one state, let's make them not be able to invest in other things. And we're going to have small, regulated utilities that we can better control. Well, that obviously created other gaps. So in 1978, after the oil embargo, we realized that it wasn't causing a lot of local investment in generation. So we put in PURPA laws to encourage, fill the gap needed for more local generation, more different types of generation, allowing utilities to buy from a lot of new generation developers, and really was the start of the domestic IPP movement. In 1992, the Energy Policy Act was signed, and that gap, believe it or not, was one of the gaps was to solve where do we put nuclear waste. So it was 1992 that Yucca Mountain was passed, and federal government would take control of it, and utility companies just need to put some money aside and don't worry about it. That hasn't been a gap. So sometimes regulations trying to solve market gaps don't work. The 1996, the gap was customer choice. And so allowing people to choose what market, what provider they want to serve their electricity. 1996 moved on to the gap of how do we get power from one place to another and getting open transmission access rights. PJM wholesale market followed closely after with how do we get a transparent market. The demand side response program in 2001 is near and dear to my heart, as I know others on the panel. And that was the first time where demand side response was acknowledged to play an active role in the markets. And we were involved in some of the creation of policy, as well as some of the other panelists, on trying to create a way for customers to be able to interact directly in these markets. FERC standard market design was an effort to solve a market gap of seams issues and how markets don't coordinate well together. Its failure resulted in many, many years of continued evolution on that path. The 2005 Federal Power Act really lifted a lot of the bans on cross-state ownership of utility companies and led to a host of mergers and acquisitions that we've seen over the last 11 years. FERC Order 755, more recently, addressed the need for fast-speed regulation, a way to allow new technology providers, often battery storage technologies, to be able to contribute and be compensated for the attributes they bring to the system. And in 2015, just a short 14 years after demand-side response programs were passed, it was determined that it was actually legal. So, again, the pace of regulatory market reform. So where are the gaps in technology? One of the things as I was going over this and preparing for it, realized there was tremendous technology improvement from the late 1800s through the 1930s. We largely, by 1950, had electrified the entire country. And it was a tremendous achievement, both in engineering as well as in the markets and the deployment of capital for a common goal. However, we then went through a period where pretty much from 1950 to the early 1970s, you just saw more people building coal units, being very conservative in terms of technology advancement, in part because of just what the monopoly rules were there that enabled and promoted that type of investment activity. You start seeing natural gas taking off, certainly through advancements in natural gas generation technology as well as fracking. And then you also start seeing renewable energy starting to make a more uptick in the market and starting to be transformative, and the crashing of coal as a percentage of the overall generation mix. So who's looking to fill the gaps? So we have many gaps that are currently in the industry. We have gaps that relate to the bottom left-hand side, which is we have gaps in wholesale market integration. How do you integrate into these wholesale markets? We have gaps on the right. How do we integrate into the retail markets? And we have some new entrants there, the Teslas and Solar Cities, and those that are somewhat going around the traditional structures of the wholesale market and regulatory and going direct to consumers. And you have those in the middle that are trying to bring together some of the wholesale and retail markets. You have, in the top left, people that are focusing on demand management and optimization. So how do you optimize these different assets and that are really focused on that? We're in the top right, people that are focused on data and how do you provide more actionable data to customers and better markets overall for them, better signals and better data to make decisions. So we did a survey of the most common innovations, and I won't go over all of these, but one of the ones that I will highlight is in the area of green energy, that it's been proven again and again that customers will pay a premium for a premium product or a product they view as premium, and that green power is one of those products that's a differentiator in the market and is widely sold. How people continue to make that differentiator if it becomes ubiquitous within the industry is one of the challenges. Other things such as new thermostats and other types of new technology devices have also started to gain traction among more and more suppliers. So, where is the industry moving? And I think this is part of, as we're looking at synchronizing the gaps, filling in gaps, how do we meet the needs? I think we really are at a crossroads, and you've heard that again and again and again. You'll hear it now again, that we are at a crossroads as an industry. I think there are three possible ways to go. The one arrow to the green, convergence, where we'll have distributed generation, storage, and the Internet of Things pulling together. And Internet of Things, whatever you call it, better communication between uses of electricity and market signals or demand signals. I mean, it's better coordination of resources. Obsolescence, that some will end up going the way of more like the landline phones or horse and buggy. I mean, in obsolescence, the regulated state-run, state-authorized, state-enforced monopoly system sucks. So I'll say it again. Since 1935, we put in laws which mandated that you buy a service from a particular provider. That is a terrible, terrible structure. If people want to get together and want to coordinate and want to go with one provider, that's great. But enforcing that by law creates tremendous challenges. One is, what do we do with obsolete distribution systems where we have essentially a regulatory covenant to pay those companies for an asset we no longer want to use? So there's obsolescence, but what do we end up doing with that under the monopoly system? And then the last one is backward. And I think we're all optimists on the stage, or we wouldn't have started our companies. But a true potential pathway is that we move backward. We go more to regulated rate of returns. You've seen utilities pushing for this structure. Usually when the energy markets are high and their generation is selling for a lot of money, that's not what they want. But when energy prices are going down, consumers are saving money, and utilities are losing money, to go backwards to that and go to more of a stranded cost recovery and integrated resource planning. So with that framework, we're going to talk a little bit about the customer. I believe Enernoc has a couple of slides to share here on some of their findings of the view from the customer side. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's start out with, I'm Marshall Chapin, Vice President of Sales at Enerac. I think we've all met yesterday. Let's start out with the bad news first, or the challenging news first. Customers don't feel like their energy providers know who they are, and the customers aren't engaging. That's the bad news first. And I think there are a number of reasons for that, but primarily utilities and retailers don't have the tools, the technology, to provide customized, personalized messaging to their customers. This is basic human nature. I was talking with someone about this last night. If you walk up to me and say, hey, Marshall, it's nice to see you again, and I say, hey, Chauncey, it's great to see you, and your name isn't Chauncey, you're not going to feel like I know you very well. We're not engaging at that point in time. We're failing in the conversation, and this is what's happening, right? I love this picture that my marketing team pulled together, primarily because all of these customers are not named Chauncey. There are a whole bunch of different categories of customers here. If you reach out to these class of business customers and try to talk to them in the same way, when you're talking to the state capitol or the hotel or the commercial real estate or the arena, you're going to be talking to them. You need to be talking to them in very different ways. They have very different types of energy usage. So personalized messaging matters for those folks. By the way, as a side note, for those who weren't in my sessions yesterday, you're not allowed to answer this, but for those who were, rather, you're not allowed to answer this. For those who weren't, does anyone know what city that is? It's St. Louis. This is fascinating to me. My first group totally missed this. No one had any idea what city it was. And we're looking at it thinking, you got a Capitol building, you got an arena, there's no possible way we can't get the answer to this. And I think the answer was, it's because the picture's taken from the arch. And when you pull like that iconic of a spot out of a city's picture, you have no idea what you're taking a picture of anymore. That's a total side note. That has nothing to do with the presentation. I just found it really interesting. I thought that was really interesting. But back to customer engagement. Why is customer engagement critical? First of all, engaged customers use more value-added services. They're actually 2 times as likely to use value-added services if they're an engaged customer, if they feel engaged with you. And second, they do your marketing for you. This is hugely valuable. If you have an engaged customer that's using your services, they then start to talk to their peers about it. And it's much more powerful. Your message getting carried from you speaking and preaching as a salesperson to customers versus a peer-to-peer, it's not even close, right? Peer-to-peer is so much more powerful. They're way more likely, and it's way more cost-effective for you as a retailer when you have your customers doing your marketing for you. That's a phenomenal flywheel effect. And the bottom line, of course, if you have customers who are engaged, who are using more value-added services, who are doing your marketing for you, they're less likely to churn. And that is the name of the game. Customers that are less likely to churn, sticky customers. I have only 3 slides. I'm keeping this very short and very simple. So Deb Merrill told us in the kickoff this morning that we have a lot of data. I think, can everyone agree, we have plenty of data right now. Getting data isn't the problem. As a matter of fact, I love the stat. I had the concept, the visual of filled iPads the size of the Great Wall of China is staggering, and it's growing incredibly fast, right? This problem is accelerating. That creates an untapped opportunity. Utilities and retailers are struggling to unlock that data and do something meaningful with that data. They need ways to get that energy data into one common view. They need analytics to be able to segment that data, to be able to speak specifically to those different customer segments. And they need ways to turn that data into customer-facing messaging, simple customer-facing messaging. It needs to be scalable. You need quick-to-deploy solutions that can pull data from those multiple sources without relying on big, massive, heavy integrations, a platform that will allow them to do that quickly and scalably. Large C&I customers may have entire teams dedicated to energy, right? They're going to dive really deep. They want deep insights. They want to go. That's very different for SMB. For SMB, SME, those customers want quick insight into their energy use and easy next steps. Quick insight into their energy use and easy next steps. They're not energy managers. Someone running a restaurant or a small chain, energy matters to them. It's an important part of their bill, but that's not the core of their business. We spend a lot of time in these sessions talking about the customer. So do they. It's not us. We're a side note for them. Energy is a side note for them. They're thinking deeply about their customer. They want quick insight into their energy use and easy next steps. And so if you've got a platform that can unlock that data meaningfully, but that's a huge barrier right now. We have all this data, but really you get the sense that folks are struggling to do something meaningful with that data. So because energy isn't intuitive for many folks, we have to help them. As I said, we have to help make it easier for them to get insight. I want to give you two interesting statistics that I'll leave you with before we go back to the rest of the panel. Communicating information that personally matters to business customers based on analytics and understanding of their energy use and business profile more than doubles the chance that they'll make a positive statement about their retailer or utility to others. Say it again, communicating information that personally matters to business customers based on data more than doubles the chance that they'll make positive comments. And if the information that personally matters is a recommended product or service, 3 times as likely to make positive comments to their peers. So it's incredibly powerful. If this can be done effectively, if we're taking that waterfall of data and providing it and having a seamless application across an entire business, right, across the retailer or utility, where if a customer service call comes in, that data is right at the fingertips to be able to make a recommendation like this that speaks directly to that specific segment. There are 1,100 NAICS codes identifying different types of businesses in North America. If it speaks to business code number 932, specifically with a recommendation to that individual, it's incredibly powerful. And it goes from hello Chauncey to hello Doug or hello Susan or whatever it is. You feel known. So tremendous opportunity here. I think we're a long way away from truly untapping this resource, but there is an incredible opportunity here, and the rewards are great for those who do it effectively. Thank you.
So now kicking off our panel, I'm going to just provide an opportunity for folks to introduce themselves. I realized that I didn't properly introduce myself. You did much better. So I'm Stephen Fernandes. I think you don't know me yet, but most of you do. So I'm founder and president of Customized Energy Solutions, and we've worked at filling the gaps for the last 18 years and trying to make a positive difference in the industry. So if we can have people introduce themselves and the organization, most of them you're all familiar with, but just to provide introductions. Want to kick off?
All right, thank you. I'm Steve Hambrick with Converge. May not be a familiar name to everyone here, but we're a demand management company working primarily with mass market customers in the utility sector. I wear a lot of hats, but the 3 things I'm most excited about in our future is, number 1, the convergence of EE and DR, where we're combining outcomes that are critical to inexpensive, reliable, and clean power, and simplifying the experience for the customer. Number 2, the Internet of Things and bring your own device as a conduit to that and other outcomes. And number 3, targeted demand management, where we work with utilities and regulators to defer investments in transmission and distribution equipment using DERs and other technologies. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Shiv Mani. I work at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and I think Stephen has taken care of introducing what the FERC does. I'd actually like to contradict him. The regulators don't only respond during emergencies. My job actually at FERC is to look at how the regulatory system works and look at how the future regulatory system is going to work. And the specific purpose of that is that you don't get into situations where you have to respond in an emergency without actually having thought out that situation.
I was saying regulators do all 4 boxes, but the one that they're certain to do.
Yeah, I mean, you do have to respond in an emergency, but that's not the only thing that we do. We tend to be somewhat more farsighted, and we actually prepare for those emergencies. So my job at the Commission is basically to look at how electricity markets and energy markets in the US and globally are changing, how technologies are changing, distributed generation and so on, and to figure out whether the market structures that we have and the rules that we have, whether they actually make sense in the context of those changes. So if you suddenly have like the shale gas revolution, and the prices of gas have gone really low, And what that has done is that the original market structure that was created, including the energy markets and the capacity markets and so on, was created with a completely different scenario in mind. And the question is, does that market structure still make sense given these new conditions? So that's basically what I do. Thank you very much.
Good morning, Jess Melanson with Tendril. We're a data analytics firm that helps customers make sense of all their data. We work with retailers, online realtors, solar companies, and primarily utilities. So our data analytics platform really helps us do two things. One, we model energy usage in the home, and then we understand the behaviors of the people living in the home. So when you put those two things together, we get a pretty complete picture of what's going on behind the meter. So with that, we help clients acquire customers. We help them engage customers. We run the largest behavioral energy efficiency program in the country. And increasingly, we're getting into device management and demand management and orchestrating the energy usage behind the meter. So where Tendril is going reflects where we think the industry is going, how we think these gaps will be filled. We see the same thing we heard in the keynote, a convergence around the customer, more of a personalized energy. In a lot of utilities, we still see silos where someone runs an energy efficiency program here and a demand response program here, and someone else is worried about customer sat. Increasingly, we're seeing those silos break down. They're sharing data, and eventually, we're going to think about the customer first and not an asset company or a commodity company. And then, in terms of device management, we do see, of Stephen's three arrows, we strongly believe in convergence. We think that there's too much value in managing demand behind the meter for it not to be aggregated, and for the market and or the regulators working together to not solve that problem. We're believers in the network. We don't think that the horse and buggy whip is the future of the utility. We actually think the future of the utility is in leveraging that network, like all kinds of other parts of the economy are doing, to create that sort of integrated sharing grid. So that's Tendril. My personal background before I came to Tendril, I worked in PSE&G, electric and gas utility, for 8 years, and before that, various positions at the PUC and in policymaking. So I have sympathy for both our beleaguered utility and our beleaguered regulators.
So I've introduced myself, but could I provide one fun fact? I think everyone knows Enernoc at this point, but this is one of the few rooms that I think may actually have a chance of finding this interesting. The beginning of the panel yesterday, Jim mentioned 1954, the solar cell, when the solar cell started. And there's enough solar companies here that I think they'll find this interesting too. My grandfather actually was an inventor at Bell Laboratories and was one of the three who invented the solar cell in 1954. Darrell Chapin, it was Chapin, Fuller, and Pearson who did it. And he did it for Bell Laboratories, not for Chapin Industries. So unfortunately, I'm having to still work and be here today. But no, he has a bunch of grandkids that are, many of whom are connected to the business in some way, and we're sort of fiercely proud of that thing. And this is one of the few rooms who may actually be connected to that and find that interesting.
Neat. That is cool. So all of our organizations, you've probably gotten the sense, were created to fill some gaps that occurred in the energy industry over the last 20 years. Even FERC was created largely to fill a gap. Originally, back in 1920, Department of Interior, how do you control water rights, how do you do that, and then evolved into the market monitor, as well as developing market rules for the system and overall tariffs. So all of us responded to gaps and looked to fill in gaps. Where do you guys see the current gaps in the markets, and what needs to change in order to fill these gaps? And Steve, if you'd like to kick it off?
Sure. One of the interesting things I wanted to say while I was up here listening to the other panelists is I don't think there's as much of a technology gap. I feel like there's a bit more of a will and a policy gap. Speaking more on the utility side, where we seem to get stuck in this endless do loop of pilots, that aren't really designed to go anywhere. There's sufficient technology between the the connected thermostats and the proliferation of smart meters now, where we can have a pretty tremendous impact on the user experience with energy in a way that offers choice, but also offers a fun experience and simplicity via automation and making interesting information consumable and easy to obtain. So when I look at it, especially again from the utility side, I think better policy and better will, in particular around rates, is the gap we're most focused on.
Just to follow up a little bit on that one, on the will, do you think it is because of a mixed incentive structure system, whereas, some companies have, their profits are largely driven by people using more electricity. So do you think will is something that the existing participants are able to overcome, or is that something that will require a further restructuring of the industry?
I think there's definitely some structural issues. In particular, there's just a lack of a risk appetite. When you see in the regulated markets, utilities will put out a dynamic pricing tariff that's really not compelling, either from an operational perspective or to drive any kind of meaningful behavior change. And everyone knows that, but it's a risk aversion, in my opinion, that drives it.
Sounds good. Shiv?
Yeah, I'd agree with Steve that technology. A lot of people have the opinion that technology certainly creates certain gaps, but technology is not really the problem. More often, it's more on the human aspects of things. So just because the gaps really go run the whole gamut, right from generation all the way down to the consumer level. So what I'd like to do is to just frame it at three levels. The first level of gaps are what I would call policy gaps and perceived policy gaps. Okay, and I would stress more on the perceived policy gaps. And the second category of gaps are what I'd call market dynamics or market design. And market dynamics includes market design. So that's the second category of gaps. And the third category of gaps would be what I refer to as customer solutions. And so this, if you look at this scheme, it's basically you go from the wholesale markets and fuel supply and everything else, all the way down to the customer level. And so I'll just give you a couple of examples for each category, and then later on in the discussion, we can get into details. So the first kind of gap, which is the policy gap and the perceived policy gap. There is some truth to the fact that the existing market structure, both the wholesale and even the retail, the utility retail structure, was essentially framed around 1935 at the time of the Federal Power Act. And so the rules that when you go to a utility commission or you come to FERC, a lot of the rules that we use, which was come from an act of Congress, basically come from 1935, and all the restructuring that Steve mentioned that's happened in the last 20 years has been done invoking what's come from the Federal Power Act. Okay, so that's the market structure that we've all inherited right now. Just in terms of reference, a lot of the stuff that Steve mentioned in the last 20 years, the changes that have happened, I've actually worked on every single one of those. So including the deregulation and demand response and so on and so forth. Now, so that's at the policy level. So there is some truth that there are these policy gaps, obviously, because if you're using a really old framework, then there are going to be gaps. But what we've also observed in the last 20 years or 25 years is that there are perceived policy gaps. And the perceived policy gaps is that any market player would, if they want a certain portion of the market or they want the market to work their way, then they perceive a gap in the market. Okay, so those are perceived policy gaps, and there are just as many perceived policy gaps as there may be. In fact, I think there are more perceived policy gaps than there are actual policy gaps. because the Federal Power Act, the rules that we get from the Federal Power Act are so broad that it actually gives agencies like FERC and even the commissions a huge amount of discretion to work with the markets and change the rules. So one example of that is what's going on in New York, for instance. Oh, by the way, I think I forgot. I do have to issue a disclaimer. And none of my opinions are entirely my own. I don't reflect the views of the Commission or any other federal government agency or any members of the Commission or staff. So that's a policy gap. So one example of a policy gap is the relationship between federal and state jurisdiction. Okay, so that's a clear issue that everyone is struggling with a little bit, and that's really happened because of a change in technology. That technology has now allowed the consumer to participate in the wholesale market and the retail market and many other markets which we're not even aware of. And frankly, we haven't organized ourselves to figure out, okay, what's the new framework going to look like? So that's a real policy gap. So in terms of the second category, which is market design and I like to just call it market dynamics, because market design is more of a term of art, and it refers specifically to design of energy markets. But market dynamics would include changes in technology. So if you have, for instance, the generating facilities, they used to have base load, intermediate load, and peaking load. And the generation bid stack was designed literally to dispatch based on that. And now you have generating units which it can act like a base load, it can act like an intermediate load, and it can act like a peaking load, and it can do all of that in 10 minutes. And so, and then you have wind, and you have intermittent resources, and you have batteries, and so on. So the market dynamics, that's an example of, and I haven't even brought in all the other information technology kind of changes. But that's an example of market dynamics, and it changes the economics of participation in these markets. And so there's a gap out there because the system is being operated and has been designed for a different technology, and so we need to recognize that. Another market gap that I mentioned earlier on is like the shale revolution and the low price of natural gas. And what that has done is that we always wanted reliability. Now going back to the Federal Power Act, one of the things that FERC looks at is that we have to keep the electricity system reliable. There are two things that we have to do. The rates should be just and reasonable, and the electricity has to be reliable. Those are literally the two things on which everything is based. So if the price of natural gas goes really low and you rely only on this one fuel, then you do have a question of fuel security, and that really affects reliability. Not to mention that there could be some baseload facilities like nuclear facilities which are not in the money and they're not in the market. So units that you used to rely on for reliability now are not really in the market anymore. And so how do you address that? So that's a gap in terms of market dynamics. Then the third category, of course, is customer solution, which everyone out here is really completely aware of. And most people in the last couple of days, yesterday and this morning, Deb Merrill have been focusing on what's called the customer solution gap, including last night's dinner speech. And they also mentioned the Ritz-Carlton and so on. So I'm actually going to take an example of the Ritz, this room, this hotel that we are all in. We'll take an example of that. So in the customer solutions gap, of course, you have this whole issue that the needs of the customer are not being met. And one of the things that is, and to tie it in with the wholesale markets, a really important dynamic, which we've not completely addressed, but in part we addressed yesterday, was the commodity business. People who sell commodity are not going to, the margins are getting thinner and thinner, And the commodity is part of the business is not where the money is going to be made. It's probably going to be made on the capacity. And if you bring it down to the customer solution level, then it's on the demand charge that they or the customer charge. So we saw that with the solar panels and so on. Now, so the problem with that is that how do you if you have an energy market where you have very cheap energy, and so you have to rely more on the capacity market to recover revenues. So, and then that comes down into the fact that your fixed charges are much higher because you have a capacity payment at the distribution level. So, but how are you going to recover those costs? And so that's how all these things are related. So what happens in the wholesale market comes straight down to the customer level to your demand charge. So those are the three instances. So for instance, in this hotel, I actually talked to the facilities manager at this hotel. Okay, so let's look at a gap at the customer solution level. It turns out, of course, they don't have natural gas out here. We're on an island, and Florida is underpiped. So this hotel spends $1 million a year on electricity, okay? And they have the sensors and the demand side management measures that they've taken are what we used to do in the 1990s and early 2000s, okay? No one has approached the facilities manager. I don't know if he's here, but his name's Richard Payne, and I asked him to come here. But his utility has not really provided him solutions as how to save money. So the energy saving measures, and he can't put in LED lights because you need to change the whole switching and so on and so forth. And every time he goes and talks to his utility, they basically tell him, well, here's page 22 of this program, and here's what it does. So that's the market that's available to you guys. And by the way, this is a great hotel. Not only the reason I approached him is because they're talking about customer service, number one customer service, and I asked him, well, what kind of customer service do you get, on the energy side? And so they have an 85% load factor. So if I were a utility, I would die to have a customer like that, because most of my customers would have, like a 50% load factor. So that's just, those are the three categories, and what I've done is I've just linked it right from the wholesale market down to the distribution level. Thank you.
Thank you. I was going to say, if they, unfortunately, this is the second time the conference is at a non-retail choice state. So if they really don't like their utility, they can move their building somewhere else.
There's work to be done on all fronts and to close all gaps, but the one that we run into the most is a policy gap. We think it's real and not just perceived. And particularly when you're working with utilities or interfacing with utilities. And the way it manifests itself is that too often the incentives of the customer, the utility shareholder, and third parties just are not aligned, and they're often in opposition. And so, the business model's not sorted out, but I think the predicate for that is getting those incentives right and aligning those incentives. And so that's true even on things we've been working at for years and years, like energy efficiency, right? We still have a lack of decoupling, a lack of shareholder incentives, and sort of these conflicting interests. And so, the technology is there. I mean, there's more technology coming down the road, but we are still working to get the technology that is there today, including Tendril software and LED lighting and everything else, implemented in the field. And really, it sort of goes back to getting the policy right. And we understand why that takes time. It should be slow. This isn't an industry where you have radical, quick change. It's dangerous. It's essential. It has to be reliable. It has to be available to everybody. So we get why that has to move slowly. But we have to work on aligning those incentives, and we're optimistic that will happen just because the opportunity is so big. We have, as an industry, we have around a 50% asset utilization rate, which is, we heard from Southwest last night, that's the equivalent of flying half-empty planes around the country. And that doesn't last. The market and policymakers will figure out how to capture that value and how to optimize it.
Thank you.
So, like FERC, I should probably offer my disclaimer. I think the views expressed here are actually completely consistent with ENERNOC and with the views of the board of directors and the like. So I actually think that I understand the comment that technology isn't the problem, it isn't the barrier, the gap, that policy and market design, and I agree those things are incredibly important. Everything you've said that everyone said is completely valid. I would flip the technology piece though and say, technology is a problem not because the technology isn't there, but because there's so much of it and so many different options that being able to test the technology and incorporate it into your business as a seamless part of doing business so that you can go back to focusing on your customer, that's the primary problem. I think about this even as a personal energy user, and I'm sure you've all experienced this. Recently, it became clear that our boiler is not going to make it. We need a new HVAC system for our house, and these things aren't cheap, and they're supposed to last a really long time. And I'm in the space, so I should be able to nail this, right? I should be able to figure this out easily. It's not trivial to figure out what the right answer to do is associated with that. All the different options, geothermal, solar, some combinations thereof, just-in-time heating of water. Where are the incentives coming from? There's a great national grid incentive for me, except that I'm a Bay State gas customer and I don't qualify for that exact one. I can go to Mass Save, but is Mass Save connected to Next Step Living? And it's incredibly confusing. And again, I'm in the business. I mean, I'm largely in the business, right? For the average homeowner or for the average business owner, when you're faced with these decisions, I think that for the most part, it's not that the technology isn't there, it's that they just have no idea what to do and where to go. And actually, to some extent, that is a policy issue, that is a market design issue. If those things are done effectively, it probably makes it easier to consume the technology to be able, but I want to make that distinction. I don't think, when I say technology or assert that technology is the problem, it's not that there aren't great technologies out there. There are phenomenal technologies out there that are reliable and are consistent. It's that taking them on is a real challenge. Knowing the right thing to do and then being able to incorporate it into your business is a real challenge.
Thank you.
I agree, and I think as an industry we've been fighting this uphill battle to get people to think more about energy, and we think ultimately it's probably a losing battle, but for a small percentage of the population, right? We talk about how people think about energy 7 minutes a year. The goal cannot be to have them think about energy 20 minutes a year. It has to be to get them to think about, to get those 7 minutes to be more efficient, to get them to action. So that means use your data, tailor your customer offers, make it mobile, so that ultimately people aren't thinking about it more because it's a commodity, that it's a means to an end. But they have the tools to do more with it and to make it simple and easy and cheaper, and then go on with the rest of their lives.
No.
This panel's boring. We're all like in violent agreement.
Yeah, no, so we'll try to shake that up. So if we can get some input from you all. So we have a survey. So we're now panel number 4, so you guys are experts at this. So if you go to your app, unlike the first one, which had 100% for the first option, I don't think we're going to have that. So, if we can put the survey up here, if you can fill out. So, what's the main issue creating a gap between how you develop versus how you implement new business strategies? So, as we look at the gap between, hey, this would be a great idea. Hey, we have to implement that great idea. How do we actually do it? Where's the gap there that you guys see? I love watching these dynamics, like as it goes up and down. As it starts out with like 2 people voting for one thing, and it's, like 80%, and then it goes up. Okay, well, I think we have a winner. So policies and requirements, although not far behind it, customer priorities, what they're looking for, and then financing and investment, and last, technology innovations. So why are we here? So we're the people who are providing some of the technology innovations to do it, but we're finding, of course, the barrier isn't necessarily the technology, as we've stated. It's, okay, how do we fit those technology solutions into the challenges? So one of the interesting things, as I had that slide up some time ago about who's going to solve these gaps. And so originally, I think, we thought utilities would. like just utilities were going to solve the gaps for their customers. One of the challenges there was we're in a much more fragmented industry than either the airline industry or the telephone industry or any other of the industries that have undergone massive deregulation in the last 20 years. We are very fragmented. So trying to get economies of scale for one utility to implement best of class demand side response or best of class technology was probably too big of a jump to expect that would organically happen. And certainly EPRI and other organizations and EEI were ideas that utilities got together and said, yeah, we have to fund some initiatives that'll benefit all of us, and we'll try to get together and do those things. But who do you guys think are going to be the main drivers of innovation as we look over the next 5 years?
I think there's always going to be a role for the utility in this, just because there's certain value streams that only the utility can unlock. You know, when you start talking about the better management of the grid and driving reliability, outage management, you know, there's a place for them, but there's also a constraint, you know, in the consensus-based decision-making of a utility. Oftentimes you get the union of every bad idea that everyone had, you know, kind of crammed into one program. And I think that's what drives some of the slow adoption of technology, where you get just an endless set of features or you know, but not meaningful choice. So I do think there's always going to be a role for the utilities, but I'm really, part of the reason Converge is here is we're really optimistic about the retailers playing a stronger role in increasing the utilization of the grid and driving down costs and bending that demand curve. I think there's a lot of potential. As we said, the technology isn't perfect, but there's plenty of technology to move a lot farther than we are today. And so optimistic that the retailers will lead the way.
Other thoughts?
I mean, I think it's going to take a collaborative effort, but we think that competitors will drive it. You know, in most industries, the incumbent doesn't innovate. It's an upstart or a competitor. And we've seen that in lots of industries, how data and analytics have transformed the industry, or you know, new offers have transformed the industry. And I think that's, you know, in many ways, SolarCity and Tesla have showed regulators what's possible, and then they respond with REV and what California is doing, what Texas is doing. And then that drives utilities to the table. When we talk to utilities in states that haven't progressed in that way, they talk about, well, we want to get ahead of this before REV happens to us, because they don't like the way that model is looking for the incumbent. So that drives the incumbent to the table. So we think it's an iterative process, but competition from retailers, from device companies, is really the key to driving and agitating for change.
Yeah, I agree. Competition and a number of the high-tech companies that are doing innovative things in other areas who start to bleed over into the space. So, I mean, certainly Nests, but even Googles and Teslas that are on the outside, I think that they will push for change and innovation in meaningful ways. I think it's going to be tough for the utilities. I had a conversation with a woman who was a longtime exec at a utility in Arizona. She'd been there for, I think, 25 or so years. Her father had just retired after 46 years in the industry at the same utility. So she had plenty of experience in this capacity, and she was forward-thinking. She was she really wanted to push change. And I said, what would it take? Utilities are typically risk-averse, right? They're relatively slow, risk-averse entities. What would it take for you to be risk-tolerant, to be a risk-taker, to go out and push change? Because she was leaning in that direction, and she paused and thought about it for a second. She said, there's just no construct for me to be able to do that. I have no meaningful way to go out and be an aggressive agent of change, given the system that I have to operate in order to generate that change. So I think utilities recognize the tenuous situation they're in. They know there's plenty of pain to go around, but the opportunity for them really to innovate, and then the DNA inside themselves with all the people who've been there for 20 some years and have an expectation of how life is supposed to go there, that's very much stacked against them in order to actually execute on that change. That's why I think, to your point, that you're going to need the sort of technology companies that have that in their DNA to quickly be thinking about innovations to push the industry.
So, I have a slightly different take on this because the question implies that, let's just wait for the incumbent to do something. And that's not how any of these markets, with any kind of innovation, that's not how it works. So there has to be someone there has to be a level of entrepreneurial spirit, and the question shouldn't be that, we're waiting for something to change so that the incumbent will do something different. It should be the market entrants come in with a new solution and solve a problem. So they need to provide an answer to the problem that exists. And just providing a technology or if it's a retailer, and I know most folks in here are retailers, but just I get these mailings and it's, your retail rate is going to be these many mils or cents lower than the utility thing. Why didn't you sign up? And to me, that's a huge headache. And I'm one of the people who actually created this market, by the way. So, but I'm on a default service where I am, but I don't even bother because for me, what's really useful is a few weeks ago, my water heater started leaking. And it's the first time it ever happened, so I was in complete panic. And it happened exactly when I was leaving for work. And I didn't have an alarm and stuff like that, so I didn't know, it just so happened I noticed it at the right time. And that's when I was looking for my utilities and my electricity service providers and everyone to say, okay, well, here's what you need to do. First, you need to shut the water mains off or whatever it is, Next is, these are all the people you can call who will come and fix it. And to me, that's a solution, and I would have been willing, and I actually did pay an arm and a leg to get it fixed ASAP because it could have done a lot of damage. But that's kind of solution that we're looking at. So why are we thinking that a utility, I gave up on my utility figuring out what I need a long time ago, okay? And that's the first thing. So why aren't the market folks responding? And same thing with the Ritz-Carlton. So yes, it's not a deregulated state. It's deregulated for natural gas, but not for electricity. Mm-hmm. And they don't have any natural gas. But why didn't someone else come in, the folks who make sensors and so on, why didn't they come in and offer a solution? Why didn't the solar industry come in and say, he does have a few solar panels on top, but because of the aesthetics and so on and so forth. So the gap out here is that Marriott has told him that you need to save 20% on your electric bill, okay? And his utility has told him, well, your electric rates are going up 14% starting next year. That's a gap that folks either in this room or somewhere else need to help him fill.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So, one of the I'm going to try something that hasn't been tried yet. So this may go down in flames, but I'm going to try to get your cooperation here. This is inspired by the presidential campaign.
Oh boy.
So everyone to yell out. I'm going to name out different industry sectors. And over the next 5 years, if you guys think they're winners or losers. And so it's a one-word answer, like the panel and everyone in the audience to answer for these companies. So the first organization, fossil fuel generators.
Losers.
Okay. Renewable generators. Okay, started off with two easy ones. Good. Okay, now you have further this. Okay, storage providers.
Winners.
Consumers. Technology companies. Competitive retailers.
Nervous.
Mm-hmm.
Distribution companies. Yeah, and I think that I think is a reflection that what's a winner? How do their stockholders view them in terms of winners or losers? If it's investing in infrastructure, getting a return on infrastructure, doing it in a consistent way. I was part of those proceedings that I really appreciate FERC facilitating on demand-side response in the early days and continued on being a big champion of that. So I don't want to say that Regulators just respond to emergencies or knee-jerk. They absolutely have had a great role. So who do we think should be on this stage 5 years from now? So fill in the gaps. 5 years from now, we have a panel called "The Gaps Were Filled," and there are some new faces on the stage. Who do we think some of those new faces might be? Who would like to give a first shot at that? Sure.
So I think that it might be someone in this room, or an entity in this room, or someone from the outside. But it's likely going to be someone who has found the solution to the problem, and they're not coming from the inside. You know, they're not saying that, well, here's how our industry works, and this is what we need you to change for us to be successful. They're going to be a bit like Uber, and you know, they're going to change it, and then they'll figure out, okay, well, what are the rules? Are these people our employees? Are they not? They'll deal with that later on. Okay, they're first going to revolutionize the industry. They'll find a solution to a problem, and then the same thing with Airbnb. You know, they're not going to say, oh well, do we have we can't go here unless you change the rules because we're going to have to pay taxes. They didn't do that. You know, they went and became a $60 billion business or something like that, and then they say, oh, by the way, yeah, that taxes and all that doesn't make sense. But if you have to, we'll talk to you about it. Okay. The same thing, and you don't have to look at Uber and Airbnb, you can look at FedEx, okay? And because yesterday at dinner, they were talking about the airline industry, and with FedEx, actually, FedEx and UPS actually, but with FedEx is a little more interesting because it's such an iconic brand name, and what they did was they revolutionized the airline industry because of the hub and spoke system, which is, people say it was originally invented by Delta before airline deregulation. And the CEO of FedEx actually took that model and used it to ship packages. And you know, that's how we are able to have this overnight packaging revolution that we had like 40 years ago, or 30 years ago. And the truth of the matter is that he was not, the Postal Service, they have rules that did not allow him to ship packages. So the original FedEx shipments the customers were companies like HP, and because there's certain equipment that they were allowed to ship. And so that equipment was classified as not being like a postal package. Okay, and so he didn't wait and say, well, now let's change all the rules. He started his business, and then the rules changed.
Yeah, makes sense. Yes.
I don't think we can predict who will be on the stage 5 years from now. And Larry Makovich in his keynote dissuaded us from pretending we can see the future. But I think the characteristics of who will win, whoever wins the customer, I think will be offer that seamless service that the customer doesn't have to think about it, and they'll be truly customer oriented. So, you know, as an industry, we still solve congestion problems by making it the customer's problem. We ask them to turn down their thermostat, we turn it down for them, we make them trade off between comfort and money. You know, we analogize with a company like Netflix. You know, they have system congestion. They don't ask you not to watch a movie on Saturday night or pay you to not watch a movie on Saturday night. They pixelate the picture in the background. They make it spool a little slower on a Saturday night, things you don't see, because they truly have a customer orientation. And we think whoever wins the customer needs that type of mindset. It needs to be seamless and truly customer first. I think the platform provider will have to be device agnostic. I think no one's going to win deciding what the devices are. I think it's going to have to be a platform that anything can plug into. And they'll need to speak customer as well as they speak utility to really bridge that gap and to find, you know, create the optimum value or the maximum value from the energy using devices. And I don't think utilities will all be losers. I think it'll vary state by state, but I think the winners will be the ones that play offense instead of defense at a point like this, and get ahead of change and try, despite their DNA, to innovate as much as they can and to collaborate as opposed to be at odds with the disruptive companies.
I just want to sort of respectively reject the premise, I guess, in some ways. I don't think you can fill the gaps and then say, great, we're done, we're in good shape. Right? You can optimize a system, but it's going to create other new gaps, right? I mean, of course it's going to. Folks are ever familiar with the book The Goal, the book about supply chain, and there's this concept of Herbie where there's some place in any kind of a supply chain, and there's raw materials are going to build up. You're going to have a bottleneck. You can alleviate that bottleneck and have better throughput, better rate through there, but it's going to create a different bottleneck somewhere in the system. Definitionally, there will be a bottleneck somewhere else in the system. So I think we will. There are going to be a number of folks that will do plenty to improve these challenges and to fill these gaps. But I think to think that in 5 years there will be groups up here that will have solved these challenges is not the right way to think of it. We're constantly going to be creating new gaps.
Fair enough. So we've got attributes of entities, but no specific names of entities who might be here. I mean, certainly we've seen Google investing in Nest, we've seen Amazon, we've seen Cisco, we've seen other companies that are striving to be some of those gaps. The presentation yesterday that showed how bad retailers do in the customer satisfaction, where we were below incumbent utilities, and utilities weren't above many. So I talk gaps. It's a matter of the gaps of getting higher. But you're right. I think Southwest would probably be the first to say that they haven't arrived at the final destination. They're always striving. So as we look at where and who does this, one of the questions that comes up is integrated versus disintegrated. So in other words, is it collaboration or is it an entity that looks to try to bring all these things together? So I find Converge to be a very interesting history of, or C-Power, the larger group, of being sort of part of a large retail load serving entity and then sort of being spun off to specialize but still serve the same customers. I'm curious of your thoughts and then any other thoughts on, is it a one-stop shop or is it more of a buffet?
Well, one of the big things that all the innovation and technology is done is in the consumerization of energy-related technology is the utilities now have kind of lost control of what's happening in their service territories. They can't manage the deployment of technology at the pace they favor. So I think that makes it really paramount that there is a partner or partners for utilities that can solve these problems for them, because Tesla's not going to wait, SolarCity's not going to wait, Nest is not going to wait. They're going to evolve and innovate. And for the utility, I always think of a customer with a Tesla and solar panels and a Nest. They could be the grid's best friend or the grid's worst enemy. And it all depends on integrations and policy and rates to determine what outcome that's going to be. And I think that I don't think there's any other possible solution but utilities find partners that can help make these connections and drive the meaningful outcomes. So I do think it's an integrated fashion or an integrated future with a lot of different vendors, not one single ecosystem either. I think there'll be multiple ecosystems, but ultimately this has got to be something someone's doing for the utilities.
Okay.
I have the same, sorry, did I interrupt? I have the same response, but in a different way. So we can say that we don't want to agree.
But disagreed.
But one of the things that we are, and this is a little bit more on the technical side, because at the end of the day, it's when you talk about demand response and all the other kind of services that are being offered, they have. There are two sides to the coin. One is at the retail side, and then say the other one's the wholesale side. I'm just doing this to keep it simple. But essentially, what technology is doing is really enabling us to bridge that gap, and in some sense, what's happening in the markets, for every physical construct, there's a financial construct. So essentially, at the retail side, you have a portfolio, and on the wholesale side, you have a portfolio. And there are some market players right now who are leveraging, they need to get revenues. They're not getting, they can't break even with these new technologies just on relying on revenues from the retail side. They need to get it from the wholesale side. And so it appears that the folks who would be most successful first at the gate would be the ones who can make this a viable portfolio, where the customer gets the customer solution, but actually in some ways, by virtue of their portfolio, they're actually providing a solution to the different markets.
So I wanted to give a chance for you all. We have this huge number screen up here you guys can't see. It's like a countdown, like for a rocket. So we have 6 minutes, 22, 21, 20 left. So with that time, I want to give you guys a chance to ask some questions before I jump in with any more. So what are some questions you all have about synchronizing the gaps? Don't make me call on you. I was told to wait an uncomfortable amount of time.
In front. Someone raised their hand.
Excellent. Yes, please.
So my question is specifically about the relationship with the customer as part of this equation. What I'm hearing from the panels is that you have to make things incredibly easy for the customer, but all of us grew up with a light switch that was on, off, or the power didn't work. So in this new environment, how do you make what you do so incredibly simple that it relates to what their prior relationship to energy was, that it has that level of simplicity, but how are you building your personal brand into something that the customer doesn't necessarily want to think about?
I can take a first swing at that.
Sure.
I think the best analogy that most folks, or many folks, can relate to is Nest and the experience with setting up a Nest and interacting with a Nest. A lot of folks, I've done some polls, a lot of people do have Nests, and my personal experience with it, when I got the Nest, just the activity of interacting with the thing itself and installing it was phenomenal. It was a phenomenal experience. And this is not an uncomplicated thing. This is not on off, right? It's an incredibly technologically advanced device. But even installing it, I found that I would look up and think, all right, now I gotta figure out what this thing has to do. And I would look down at the instructions and it would say, you're probably thinking about what this thing has to do. And it's like, that's exactly what I was thinking about. It was delightful, the entire experience. And then interacting with it, it sort of was answering the questions that I had right there in that moment. And there's, after the fun part of it wears off, it's just a tool that works. It's simple for me to interact with right now, and it works. So it's not that the technology has to be super simple. It's that the experience for the user has to meet them where they are. I wanted that much. If I can go deeper, I can. But I don't have to wade through stuff to be able to find it. It's right there, and if I want to click through, I know where I can click through. I can find the information. It's available to me. So that's the distinction. This is not an easy thing to do. To take a really complicated thing and make it seem easy and anticipate the stages that people are going to go through to be able to find that information, that's non-trivial. That's a hard thing to do. But I do think that that's the challenge in front of us. And I am now up here in front of all of you preaching about Nest. That's an engaged customer who's a brand ambassador. There are a bunch of former Enterknockers who are at Nest. It's a great company. But the point is, they created, with a very technologically advanced device, a simple experience for me to interact with it that made me a brand ambassador. And I think it's possible. It's just very hard to do.
And I would like to, build on that. The prior universe wasn't as simple or as convenient, I think, as you sometimes think it was. I know living in Atlanta in the summer, my choice was if I got home from work early, I either walked into a 94-degree house and sweated through my shirt, or I ran the air conditioner, around the clock and came home to a $700 bill. Like that was not a wonderful choice that I had. And if we can allow some kind of anticipatory automation that drives more meaningful choice, but also control for those customers that need or want it, I think that then we are headed towards a more compelling future, like Jess and everyone mentioned.
Yeah, we talk a lot about the changing desires of the customer, and I'm not sure how much they've changed when it comes to energy, right? They want it to be reliable first, affordable second, and clean maybe a distant third, as long as the first two are met. They have more choices now, they have more tools to get there, they have more offers, but I don't think that changes the fundamental value proposition that they just want it to work and not be expensive and be in the background. And I think the trick is finding tools to help meet those needs in a more complex environment, but that is equally seamless, and then gets more customer oriented, right? So we probably do move from kilowatt hour pricing to, as other industries like telecom have, to more of a fixed bill or a tiered fixed bill. We have the tools to manage that risk now and manage the demand and make that kind of an offer happen. So I think that simplification will continue, but the customers, I'm not sure the customers' demands are changing that much. We just need to find better ways to meet them.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question.
Yep, there's one.
Yes.
Constellation. First of all, great discussion. Thanks very much. I just wanted to get the panel's thoughts with regard to one of the challenges that I think is inherent within our industry, and it is that of we live in a space that has an intermediary between us and the customer, and that's in the form of the utility service companies. You talked a little bit before about how other restructured markets are nowhere near as balkanized as our industry is, but what would your response be to that fundamental challenge of how we don't own the bill, we don't own the customer relationship, and how do you see, from a gap perspective, us being able to solve that particular issue?
Anyone like to, yes, but if you, Shiv, if you'd
I
like
had
to,
a little problem hearing, could you
So
repeat
yeah,
the question?
the question was, how do we deal with balkanization? We don't have utility metering, or often we don't have access to the bill, the customer relationship. It's a very fragmented system. How do we manage that in meeting the gaps? Is that a good summary?
Yeah, in that, suppliers have to work with utilities in order to engage customers, get access to data, and there's an intermediary in our industry. It's not just that it's not just that we are as more balkanized than airlines or some of the other restructured industries. It's that we actually have to work with a separate entity in order to engage with the customers, and how can we address that?
And out here, the intermediary you're saying would be the utility, is
Correct.
that the issue?
Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, ever since, Stephen, you can attest to this, ever since the whole retail access began, we've had this 100-year relationship where the utility is the custodian of the customer and really looks out for the interests of the customer. And so right from the beginning, literally the first day in terms of the design, the utility, we had to discuss, and this was a long time ago, so I don't remember everything, but we had to discuss, well, what is the protocol, how much customer information is going to be shared. And if in the last 20 years, this was in the 90s, when I was working on it in Massachusetts, was in 1995, 1996, that time frame. And then we got deregulation in 1998. But if that relationship has not been re-examined, which is what they're doing in New York, because in New York it looks like, and some other states, it looks like they've recognized that and a lot of other things. But maybe that's what needs to be re-examined, because we didn't have the technologies, we didn't have the information. And so this is an iterative process. So it looks like the retail suppliers were built based on that first or second, literally that first iteration. And maybe the regulatory world and the retail suppliers need to have a conversation as to, well, okay, this is what's working and this is what's not working, and here's where we see a gap, and address it.
Yeah.
I definitely understand that construct is a bit of a barrier, but I think, to me, to have the customer relationship, you just innovate and take it. Nest is a great example. You've got people up here who are quasi-competitors of Nest, advocating how much we love the product. They don't have access to even the utility data, but they developed something really compelling, and they went out and took it, and I would love to see more of that from the retailers.
Yeah, and for instance, then when I found out yesterday about this hotel, I mean, the first question that it came to, they have two sensors in this place. One is in the closet in your room. When you open the closet, the light comes on, and that's not a sensor. It's the same kind of button that you have in your refrigerator. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that we've had forever. Okay, and the other sensor is when you open the balcony door, the AC goes off immediately, and that really is a sensor because that's like your alarm. But the question and there are now so many other sensors that all these folks are working on, Tendril and so on, and which are so much more sophisticated. And it's just occurred to me that why didn't these guys come? You don't have to be a retail supplier. You just have to come and see, look, there's so much potential. You spend $1 million a year. If we reduce your electricity bill by $100,000, and then you give us all the 1,000 Marriott hotels across the world, then you're making $10 million right out there.
So one additional thing I would say, just the specific one about the utility billing, I don't think it's a coincidence that Texas, where the retail supplier has the bill and has the full responsibility, that they're rated higher than the other states. So I think that to some degree, we as a retailer community need to wean ourselves off of the whole POR model with utility consolidated billing, and actually say, we're adults, we can bill our own customers and handle collections and actually handle the customer relationship. We don't just want to just give that to someone else to do. So I think that's, some of that is on us. But I really appreciate the opportunity to present this panel. If we can give a hand to all the panelists, thank you.